In 2024, the Denver Broncos defensive line should be significantly better than what they've been for the past handful of years. With new additions, new faces, and a new attitude inside that room, the Broncos D-line group is deep and loaded with depth. We'll talk about it on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country who tune in, making us their first listen of the day. Every single day. We appreciate you so much. Just a reminder for anybody out there, you can subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. Our training camp position previews continue. The Broncos defensive line comes under the microscope here. Sayre, this has been a position group for the last handful of years where they've had some good players on that unit, but we've always asked the question, can they get more out of their depth, out of guys behind the starters, right? Injuries have obviously impacted this unit historically over the last handful of years, but this offseason, the Broncos revamped their entire defensive line, really changing one spot, but the potential starting lineup that we believe will be the case here, I think gives the Broncos the best defensive line group on paper that they've had in quite some time. And honestly, that starts with John Franklin Myers, probably the most underrated, biggest offseason acquisition outside of the Broncos drafting Bo Nix 12th overall. This was big for Denver's defensive line, and it happened in that NFL draft.
It did. The Broncos got him for virtually nothing from the New York Jets, right? I mean, the Jets wanted to kind of dump some salary after they picked up Hassan Reddick in a trade. And I guess there weren't that many takers for John Franklin Myers, which is shocking to me, Cody, because I know that we've talked about him before on this show and in terms of when he was last a free agent and being a really coveted player after he was with the Rams and then playing well for the Jets. I mean, he's been very consistent, and Sean Payton talked about that. Like when you look statistically at what he was able to do in terms of quarterback hits, sacks, tackles for loss, pressures, like he's been one of the most underrated guys in the entire NFL in terms of interior defensive line production. So to get him for a 2026 sixth round pick, I mean, the Broncos gave up nothing to get this guy. And then not only that, they didn't even have to just absorb his salary, right? They re-signed him to a 2-year deal worth about $15 million. And that contract, if we put it up against all the other free agent acquisitions the Broncos made, that would be the highest average annual value of any free agent the Broncos picked up in 2024. So not only are we talking about a steal in a trade, we're talking about the team's biggest investment this offseason in terms of a non-draft pick player who's coming in with that salary. So I really love this move, and it kind of completely changed the vibe of draft weekend, didn't it? When we were going through and you knew the Broncos weren't going to be able to hit every single need in this draft. You and I did many mock draft simulations, and we're like, there's no way to like piece together this puzzle properly. It's an impossible Sudoku, as I like to sometimes kind of say, right? Well, then you trade a future draft pick that's inconsequential right now for a starter, a really high quality starter. Now, all of a sudden, you got a franchise QB, you picked up a pass rusher, you stole Troy Franklin in the 4th, and then you get the starting D lineman on top of it all. I mean, it changed the complexion of the offseason.
No, 100%. And you mentioned some great reference points. Like you and I did an episode not too long ago talking about the impact when we were analyzing the edge rushers in our position previews. We're talking about how important pressure is, right? How pressure is a very paramount statistic in today's NFL. Like it's not really documented by NFL.com, but Pro Football Reference obviously does a great job of keeping note of this. I want to read off here just from the defensive tackle, defensive end position here from John Franklin Myers. The last 4 seasons, how many pressures he's got. 2020, he had 23 pressures. 2021, he had 25 pressures on the quarterback. 2022, 21 pressures. And then last season, he had 27 pressures on the quarterback. You just talk about the impact that has there. I mean, we saw it firsthand. The Jets defense, look, we can say what we want, throw as many shots about the Jets, their offense, Nathaniel Hackett, as much as we want to. That defense was pretty solid. They were very stingy last season. They have that obviously under the identity of Robert Saleh. He is a player that will come in and make a difference. Now, what you're doing is you get a guy like him that creates the amount of pressures he does at the rate he does at the defensive end position. What does that do for guys like Nick Bonito, Jonathan Cooper, Baron Browning, who also generate pressures themselves? What does it do for DJ Jones now playing the nose tackle position? What does it do for Zach Allen in terms of him playing the other defensive end position? This is the best overall formula, I think, for the Broncos to have success this upcoming season. John Franklin Myers, a huge addition for them. But then you talk about the two guys who are returning here. Like the storyline here for the defensive line is obviously John Franklin Myers, but Jamar Cain, underrated story here, being promoted to defensive line coach, seemingly knows how to generate pressure. Zach Allen said it during the OTA period before we took a break to head off, until the buildup for training camp, said that the identity, like it's different here at the defensive line with Jamar Cain coaching. He said their philosophy is to be more attacking versus last year was more read and react. This year they're attacking. And then, I think with the nucleus, the DNA that they've built with these guys here with Zach Allen, DJ Jones, John Franklin Myers, who we anticipate that's going to be the starting three there if the Broncos stay in their 3-4 base defense. I like that. I like that unit quite a bit. And look, for DJ Jones, I feel like a lot of the storylines this offseason were, okay, is he going to be a cap casualty? Like after the Broncos released Russell Wilson, Justin Simmons, we anticipated Garrett Bowles being one of those guys. But then it's like, all right, well now if who's the next guy? Like DJ Jones is one of those guys. He has stayed, like the vibe has just stayed quiet around him. The Broncos like him a lot, but he's entering the last year of his deal. So DJ Jones himself this upcoming season is playing for a contract extension. Zach Allen looking to be the player that the Broncos brought in last season. I think that the pieces are there for the Broncos front seven to have significant success this upcoming season. And really it's going to start with these three players on the defensive line. I think it'll make everything better for the linebackers, for the secondary as well.
It's one of the best top threes the Broncos have had in recent years, Cody, at least in my opinion. I know that the gold standard is, of course, the unit that we saw back in 2015 with Derek Wolfe and Malik Jackson both out there. And then you're obviously rotating in a number of other quality players, Sylvester Williams, Vance Walker, a lot of really good players on that D line. This, to me, is the best interior defensive line the Broncos have had in quite some time. Remember, back in 2018, we were relying on guys like Shelby Harris to come through and have a breakout season. Like the Broncos haven't entered a season with three guys as proven as these players. I'd have to go back and do some research, Cody. I kind of just thought of that right now. I'm trying to go through recent history in my brain. But man, anyone in the comments, drop it down there and tell me, when's the last top three the Broncos had that's this good on paper in terms of, Zach Allen, he's one of the better defensive linemen in terms of getting pressure, getting to the quarterback in the league. That's why the Broncos signed him to a deal worth north of $15 million per season. And it's why they kicked the can down the road and restructuring his deal this year to create cap space, because they know he's a core player for them. DJ Jones, there's a reason why they cut other guys and let other guys go and kept his deal where it is, because they believe that he can be a key piece here. When he came from the 49ers, he was a tackle for loss machine. So this has the opportunity to be maybe the best top three on the defensive line, which we've talked this offseason. I think having that top three on the defensive line raises the floor of the entire team. When you win the line of scrimmage, you are going to win more games than people think. Some people don't think the Broncos are going to win games at all this year, Cody. This defensive line is going to elevate this overall, just the overall complexion of the roster entirely. So this is one of the position groups that I'm most excited about for 2024.
Well, it was the biggest area that George Paton said the team needed to improve this offseason. They've gone out, they've made moves, adding starters, and also key guys on the back end really that are going to rotate in and have an impactful role. We'll analyze the Broncos' depth behind the starting three that we project here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. And look, Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball. Summer's here, which makes getting tickets faster and easier on the Game Time app, because prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer that it gets to the first pitch. So take your friends, your family out, enjoy an evening out catching some games at the ballpark here this summer with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. One thing I like about the Game Time app is they always have last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% off of buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and other events that are going on in your area. Or I like the all-in pricing feature where you can toggle this feature that shows you what your total up front. So when you go to checkout, you're not hit with any surprise fees. You know exactly what the cost is up front. Plus, seat views, you get a panoramic view from the seat in the app before you buy. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase today. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed.
The Denver Broncos have intriguing depth behind their stellar top three on the starting defensive line. What does that depth look like? Who's going to be playing this year? We're going to talk about that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you who make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere that you get your podcasts, as well as you can watch the show on YouTube. And you know what? You should. If you haven't watched us on YouTube, go ahead and do so and hit subscribe over there to get out Locked On Broncos in front of more eyes of Broncos country. We appreciate you for doing that. And if you haven't already, stick around on YouTube. Check out Locked On Sports Today. It's curated coverage from local experts who cover the teams that you love, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. So check out Locked On Sports Today, part of the Locked On Sports Network, your team every day. Cody, we got to talk about depth on the defensive line, which was non-existent last year. I mean, I feel like we've had a similar discussion for a number of positions in our position previews, is that, man, the Broncos finally have depth this year at position X, Y, and Z. Defensive line is another one of these areas where it wasn't just the starting unit that was getting gashed last year. And remember, last year's top three on the D-line for the Broncos was Zach Allen, D.J. Jones, and Jonathan Harris, who was barely even thought of in free agency by other teams. So now you've got actual depth on this team. And let's start off by talking about probably the number one depth guy, Malcolm Roach, who came in, was one of the first free agents the team signed. He should be a really nice addition on, I'm not going to say sub packages, but he's probably only going to play 400 snaps or so this year. What do you think about this guy coming in from the New Orleans Saints?
I like the pick, and players in the locker room, they like the pick. PJ Locke obviously played, with them, obviously the University of Texas. The Broncos making a run on Texas players here, but PJ Locke said it, and I can't say it verbatim, but basically PJ said that Malcolm Roach is bat spit crazy instead of the other word there. But it's a good thing. Like, he brings the energy. He's a tone setter, and he's a guy that's going to energize the locker room. Now, I can tell you this, just watching him during OTAs, a mandatory minicamp, look, there's no pads, but you get a sense that these guys are going to play really well off one another, especially on the defensive line, because Malcolm Roach has his personality. I think we already know DJ Jones has one of the best personalities on the team. Those two guys together are fun to watch. Now you added John Franklin Myers. Like, that is going to be a defensive line group that I think has this different mentality to them. What was it last year? The last couple of years has been the dark side. I think that's gone. I don't think the dark side is going to be a thing. I think they're going to create an entirely different mentality. They know how to flip the switch, but he's an impactful player. And look, Malcolm Roach, in my opinion, for where he came in terms of New Orleans, like, I think it played out well for the Broncos in terms of this offseason, because Malcolm Roach was one of the free agency moves, and we're like, all right, is Malcolm going to be the starting defensive tackle? Like, is he going to be an every down player? This was before John Franklin Myers. Like, we anticipated it was going to be DJ Jones, Zach Allen at DN, and then Malcolm Roach at D tackle. But then now, once they acquired John Franklin Myers, everything started to make sense a little bit. But what stands out to me is that Malcolm Roach can play that defensive end position at times if they ask him to. If he wants to play over and play inside, he wants to play a 3 tech, he wants to play a 4-eye, he can even play the 5, but he's going to primarily rotate in on the defensive tackle position. He and DJ Jones, I think, have a skill set to them that are going to make them versatile enough to where you don't necessarily have to worry about one of these guys being on the field too long. I think they complement each other, where it's okay, it's going to be DJ, and then it's going to be Malcolm, and then they go out and they get a veteran player in Angelo Blackson, who played for the Jacksonville Jaguars last year. And Sayre, look, I came away impressed with him during OTAs, a mandatory minicamp. I think they got a steady rotation of 3 guys that can come in to where they are fresh. And I think that has been an issue for the Broncos defensive line in moments where they've given up some big plays on the ground, which unfortunately that seemed to happen quite a bit last year for Denver. Guys were tired, and that wears on you. And when you're tired, your feet stop moving as much. You're not able to anchor down. Like, there's a reason they replaced guys like Mike Purcell and Jonathan Harris. They have completely revamped this defensive line group, and it's really going to be headlined in terms of depth players rotating in. Malcolm Roach, Angelo Blackson are a couple of names here to start, and then you have some young guys on this roster from last year that are still trying to work their way into a rotation to win a roster spot.
Yeah, well, George Payton at the draft mentioned Matt Henningsen by name in terms of talking about other defensive line depth. And I think he's worth mentioning as a former 6th-round pick, entering now his 3rd season. So there's a lot of guys that we don't necessarily talk a lot about on the show in terms of, man, this guy could really break out this year. I just don't think we've seen enough from Matt Henningsen to be able to effectively say, like, yep, he's definitely in line for that breakout year, because he kind of had the top opportunity last year when Yoma Uwazurike got suspended and things like that. So I'm excited to see how he responds to that, because the team obviously still likes him quite a bit. Remember, we talked about it, former walk-on at Wisconsin who became a scholarship player, became an NFL draft pick. I mean, very cool story, and a guy who works his butt off. Elijah Garcia is another player who, behind the scenes, we saw in last year's preseason. I think a guy that was as hungry as anybody on this team, played really well in the preseason. He's got that size of more of the 5 technique of the guy who's going to play the defensive end in a 3-man front, right? He looks more like that type of guy, the big, tall, long, quick. I mean, he's got the ability to rotate as all these guys do. But I think Garcia is another player, Cody, that he's one of those dark horse candidates to round out this defensive line group, whatever it ends up looking like. So there are young guys. Former 6th-round pick Jordan Jackson of the New Orleans Saints wasn't there when Sean Payton was there, but came over to the Broncos last year. And then you've got a couple of kind of unheralded, undrafted guys could factor into the mix, depending on how training camp and preseason play goes as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about guys like Brandon Matterson, Jordan Miller, and then I think we also have to talk a little bit about this. I know we brought him up in our outside linebacker preview because he's listed as an outside linebacker on the team's website, but Dondre Tillman, the UFL star that came over in terms of pressure creation and just impact and quarterback hits that we saw at the UFL level for the Birmingham Stallions. Like, my question here is, like, you and I think are in agreement. We think he's got more of a body type to play DN tackle here at the NFL level with his size, especially at 270 pounds. Like, that's where we see him playing a little bit, which to me is like, all right, you need guys like, okay, if John Franklin Myers and Zach Allen are going to be your 2 starters, they're going to be on the field quite a bit, probably more than anybody else at defensive tackle, under that assumption there. But who are going to be the rotation guys? Like Tillman right now, I think that spot between Tillman, I think you look at Garcia, Henningsen. I think right now there's competition to be like, can you be one of those 2 deep guys at defensive end here for the Broncos behind those guys? And I think that's where it's getting a little bit more interesting here about this position in particular, in the interior defensive line, because there are opportunities behind the starters, behind the veteran guys to come in and get rotational reps because you need it. But this is also the perfect segue, in my opinion, to develop these guys, to get them valuable experience. And look, these guys can play a lot of special teams, in my opinion. You need guys that are big-bodied, athletic. I think guys like Tillman, I think guys like Garcia, Henningsen, they can play a lot on special teams and have an impact. This is a good problem to have here for the Broncos. And, maybe with Jamar Cain being the defensive line coach, maybe what he needs and what he's looking for is philosophically different than what Marcus Dixon had last year from this position group, right? And maybe that's something that we're going to have to see. But it's all about who makes noise here in training camp. And obviously, I think preseason games probably matter most. That's really where Elijah Garcia came into his own, was in those preseason games. He made the case to make the roster, and he certainly did just that. But now the stakes are higher here. The Broncos' depth, in my opinion, I think is good. But now it's like, how do you solidify that? Who's going to stand out? Who's going to earn that spot here? It looks good on paper right now, Sayre, but we'll see how it all pans out here going forward as the Broncos get ready to report for training camp. It's right around the corner here, Broncos country. And you know what? As always on this episode of the show, we're going to get into our 53-man roster predictions, where we're going to look at the Broncos' interior defensive line. How many guys are they going to keep, and who are they going to keep? Sayre and I are going to share our thoughts and make our case here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. As we jump to the fourth quarter action on today's episode of the show, real quick, Broncos Country, thank you once again for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day, especially to all you everydayers out there. It means the world that you take time out of your day to listen to us, to watch us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast for all your Broncos news, content coverage, and more. Subscribe and like the video as well so it gets put into the algorithm so more members of Broncos Country find this podcast. And if you have friends and family that are Broncos fans that don't know about this podcast, share this podcast with them as well so we can continue to grow the show to bring you the best objective daily Broncos news, content coverage, analysis, and more here. Sayre, this is always the fun exercise. I always enjoy this. I love when Broncos fans as well are sending us who they think are going to make the position group, who's going to stand out on the roster here. When we talk about the 53-man for the defensive line position specifically, we always have to ask the question, right? It's a numbers game. Like, how many players are they going to keep in this position? Because ultimately, you're only allowed 53 players on your active roster. I hope one day the NFL looks to expand that, especially if they're looking to add another regular season game. I feel like it should bump up to 58, in my opinion, or even 60 at that matter. I don't see what the problem would be in that, but that's another episode for another day. How do you see the defensive line room playing out here? Who are your starters? Who are your depth options? How many guys do you have the Broncos keeping here?
Well, we talked about the top three, right? Zach Allen, John Franklin Myers, and D.J. Jones. I think those guys are no-brainers. Malcolm Roach will take the fourth spot behind them. And then I think there's maybe some room for, creativity, room for guys to break through. I think Angelo Blackson right now stands out as the fifth guy to me, being the veteran. The Broncos brought him in. I don't know that they just brought him in to necessarily, I guess, raise the floor. So I'm trying to think of another phrase here, Cody. So if anybody's got another idea, I like the raise the floor idea, though, for these young players. You see Angelo Blackson coming to work every day, a veteran who's been in the league. He's been a pro, played a lot of football for a long time. And you're these young guys and you see this guy coming in, you've got to elevate. You got to be better than Angelo Blackson to make the roster. That's going to be an interesting thing to watch throughout training camp and the preseason. But I do think there are guys to do it. Like I'm intrigued by Elijah Garcia. I'm intrigued by Matt Henningsen in year 3. I'm really interested to find out what's going to happen with Ioma Uwazurike, because our good friend Mike Kliss of 9 News reported just before the 4th of July holiday that there could be a delay in terms of him getting reinstated to the NFL with a criminal probe going into this whole gambling situation that he's facing. So if there's a delay, which as of right now, Ioma Uwazurike, for anyone that's listening and you're wondering, like, what is his situation? When could he come back? Well, he's eligible to be reinstated the day after veterans report for Broncos training camp. So he's eligible to be reinstated as of right now on July 24, veterans report on July 23. So he is like cutting it razor thin. And what's really interesting is that George Paton also mentioned him back at the NFL draft. Cody, I was going through some old clips and pieces from press conferences that were done. And when referencing the depth on the D line, I mentioned earlier, he said Matt Henningsen by name. He also said Ioma Uwazurike by name. So I'm fascinated by what could be if he returns, because he was supposed to be, I think, that starting D end before Jonathan Harris ended up taking over. I mean, that was kind of a shocker last year, right at training camp time. I think the plan was Uwazurike starting opposite Zach Allen, and then that plan was just completely derailed. So could he be the 6th guy? I think that is very much a possibility.
No, I think there is a possibility. I think the one thing that's working against Ioma Uwazurike, unfortunately, like with him being suspended indefinitely, I mean, he has not been able to have access to coaches, the weight room, the team facility, the perks of being an NFL player. Like those have all been shelved for him. And so you have to really hope that he's been taking this time. Like obviously he's been going to, I believe Mike had reported, Gambling Anonymous. He's also been going to individual therapy, which is a good thing. And obviously I hope he's in a really good spot. And it's tough to be in this position. He's a young guy. He made a mistake. But the fact that the Broncos, and they could have moved on from him a long time ago, right? But they didn't do that. They're still sticking by him. I think they'll give him a chance. Obviously, if he does get reinstated here, they'll give him a chance to see where things go. Part of me wonders, though, Sayre, like what happens if the NFL with Roger Goodell doesn't reinstate him? Like, does that mean like, all right, well, hey, it's kind of like this pointless thing? Because when you look at what he did in terms of the whole gambling scenario, he bet on games that he played in. He bet on his own team. He bet on himself a little bit, which Can't do that in the NFL, right? I mean, obviously you can't do that. That was different than what some other guys were doing. And obviously we see it in the NBA with Jonte Porter betting on himself. He's banned indefinitely from the NBA because of that. Is it going to be different here for Uwazurike? We've already seen some players reinstated. If he doesn't get reinstated, it really makes me question, okay, will the Broncos at that point be forced to move on from him if that is the case? Something to follow here. But I agree with you, Sayre. It's like I'm intrigued by all these guys, these young guys that the Broncos do have. When we talk about in terms of the rotation, I think it's a guaranteed shoe-in here for obviously JFM, Zach Allen, DJ Jones, Angelo Blackson, Malcolm Roach. But I think you're going to see a widespread competition for that sixth spot between Elijah Garcia, Matt Henningsen, and also I think Dondre Tillman. I think I'm considering him as that defensive end guy. I've got him as the last guy to make it. I've got Denver keeping 6 defensive linemen, guys who could play a little bit of tackle and defensive end if need be. My overall projection is going to be those guys, and then the last guy being Dondre Tillman, which I think you can have room for a guy like Elijah Garcia to bring him back on the practice squad if he clears waivers. Jordan Jackson is obviously a guy I think will clear waivers and will be back on the practice squad. But then that means it's like, all right, well, if my situation plays out the way I projected, that means that Matt Henningsen is going to be released. I would like to just see Matt Henningsen come out here this offseason during preseason. I would love to just see him come out there and attack it and be undenied, so to speak. Like, that's the one thing that you have to see. Like, with all these moves that Denver has made, those guys who've been on this roster for quite some time, they can't just play at the rate in which they've been playing. It has to elevate where they're at with their game specifically. And so I think Matt Henningsen has a lot of pressure on him coming into training camp, into the preseason. I'm excited to see how he responds because he's got a great work ethic. He's got a great attitude, but the NFL is a constantly evolving business and you consistently have to get better. The teams have done that. Can he now do that as a means of having that chip on his shoulder? I'm excited to see if that's how it plays out.
This is one of those position groups that when you talk about preseason games and when we're sitting here reacting to the preseason games, I mean, the defensive line is always going to be discussed because it's one of the easiest positions that to stand out or not. When you're talking about, man, that quarterback on the second and third offense for, let's say the Colts, the Broncos play them in the preseason. He was just picking them apart. He had all day. He was knitting sweaters in the pocket back there. If you're the defensive line that's on the field during that time, you don't want to be those guys, right? Because we're going to be able to see that easily and immediately when these games are happening. So for these defensive linemen, you want to be the guys that we're like raving about in the first segment after these preseason games. Like, man, this guy, he was wrecking the opposing offensive line all game long. And that's what somebody needs to do. To your point, Cody, they need to come out here in the preseason and at training camp and just make it undeniable that like they belong on this roster. And that's, I don't know who that's going to come from. I just don't know at this point. I think it's going to be fun to watch. And I think that there's many options. Like, could it be one of these undrafted guys? We haven't really even gotten into the weeds too much on those guys at all yet, but could it be Jordan Jackson, who the team has had him around now for a while and they like him a lot, obviously. It's going to be a fun position group. And the great news is that we're not talking about needing somebody to emerge as the third or fourth guy. We're talking about somebody needing to emerge as the fifth or sixth guy at best. So that's what's exciting to me about this position battle is that, man, it's kind of like the Joker busting the pool cue over his leg and saying, we're having tryouts, right? There's only one spot on the team, and there's like 6 guys that are fighting for it. I can't wait for this particular battle to unfold over the next couple of weeks.
It's going to be a good problem to have. And look, the defensive line is one of the more intriguing storylines for this team going into training camp. We're going to be monitoring it every single day. And look, Broncos Country, once again, make Locked On Broncos your daily. If you're listening on Mondays and Tuesdays, but you're not listening Wednesdays, Thursdays, or Fridays, you got to bump that up 5 days per week. Every single day, all year long, we have you covered with fresh, objective Broncos news, coverage, content, analysis, and more. Looking forward to meeting with some of you fans out there in training camp. The defensive line is the one I've got my eye on the most out of these position groups. Can they take the step forward that we think they can with the additions they've made to get better on paper? We think so. We hope so. And we'll see if that pans out here for the Broncos this upcoming season. But with that said, Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show. Our position preview series continues tomorrow as we analyze the safety room. The Broncos, they're relying a lot on P.J. Locke, Caden Stearns, and Brandon Jones to take over the mantle after the team had to move on from Justin Simmons this offseason. What does the safety room look like? What does the depth look like there? We'll break it all down on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.